on our part 2 of the weekly recap of the specs performances. Now it's time to look over Mythic Plus. So we are now at the end of the 3rd week of the season, or the beginning of the 4th week of the season. We have gone through now another tyrannical reset, which is more relevant than the first one, because the first one was the beginning of the season. Basically, nobody had a 4-piece set bonus when we looked at the first week. Very few players even knew about what the dungeons even did. The dungeons were also unnerfed. So, week 1 of Tyrannical was, way more scuffed and experimental than this one. So now we have gotten a more serious, a more proper and full Tyrannical week compared to the first one. So now we have even more clear results compared to week 1. Now, talking about the actual results, since we mentioned them right now, as usual, we go and look at the popularity of the specs in Mythic Plus, starting from the tanks. We are, as usual, pleased to see that when it comes to all key levels, tanks are quite even and quite balanced. We have the outlier of Brewmaster Monk, but besides them, as you can see, they are all quite healthy. They're all quite played and spread overall. Once you get into the more competitive level of keys, it's not even that bad still. Yes, the 3 outliers go towards the bottom, Guardian, Brewmaster and Protection Warrior, and the 3 left over, Pot Paladin, Blood DK and Vengeance Demon Hunter, make up for almost over 70% of the remaining tanks. Then again though, still having at least 3 options, still having at least 3 choices once you go up the 20 plus key level is still quite healthy. It's only once you enter the 25 plus, the higher level of key, that Vengeance becomes way more popular. However, you still see a pretty healthy population of both Blood and Protection Paladin. So this is still actually an acceptably good level of popularity of tanks in the very highest of key levels. Even having the option to choose between 3 of them is quite good as far as tanks are concerned. We could be saying somewhat similar for healers. Once more, you go at all key levels and they are similarly spread, similarly even across all of the choices. You then enter the 20 plus range and it almost doesn't change. There's a very slight difference in terms of popularity. Most of the specs remain more or less how they were before. And then you enter the very higher level of keys, and this is even better. This is even more even than the tanks, because if the tanks had 1 option and then a couple of extra options, if you go to the healer one, you have 1, 2, 3 even options and then a 4th one. So it's even more varied. There are even more options when you go to the higher level of keys for the healers. So right now, it's a very good start in terms of variety, in terms of choices for your Mythic Plus composition. Now, is it the same for the DPS? Because the DPS already starts on a different note. Unlike the even and spread popularity of tanks and healers at all key levels, when you enter the melee, you already see something different. You already see Havoc and Ret being far above the rest at all key levels. Once you enter the 20 plus, you still see Havoc and Ret being wildly the more popular options across all of the specs of melee, and then it is only once you enter the 25 plus that Ret goes far lower down and Havoc grows even more. So compared to the tanks having at least 3 or so options, the healers even having 4, once you go into the melee, it's kind of like 3, or rather 1, and then Rogue, either Assassination or Outlaw, with Ret losing way more of their popularity compared to the lower level of keys. That's the first thing you can notice in the melee DPS. Then you enter the ranged. Ranged are back to being more spread and more even, like we talked about for healers and tanks. Here you can immediately see the popularity outliers for melee, but for ranged, yes, there is BM Hunter as usual, but besides them, there are varied options across all choices. Then you enter the 20 plus range, almost doesn't move, almost like no changes, more or less, in terms of popularity. And then you enter the very, very high level of keys, and still you do have a few options, definitely more than the melee. Because while BM Hunter is still there, Augmentation is of course still here. You have Balance, you have Demo, you have double option for mages, either Fire or Frost. So you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, compared to the 1, 2, maybe 3 for melee. So that's twice as many options when it comes to your ranged DPS composition. So at the very least, one of the things we were more worried about when looking at the melee comp is, are we going to get something similar like the Exodia composition of Season 2? Are we going to have just some extremely clear winners in terms of performances in Mythic Plus like we did in Season 2? For now, approaching the 4th reset of Season 3, the first month of the season, the answer is a healthy no. The answer is not really. Yes, we have some specs that are more popular than others, like Havoc or like Augmentation, but it's still a debate when you go after that, when you go beyond that. There is still plenty of other viable and popular options when it comes to the DPS. And even going across tanks, as mentioned, yes, Vengeance is popular, but we have seen plenty of Prot Paladins and even Blood DKs. Same goes for healers, where we have seen Discipline being the more popular one. But then when you look at the rest of the healers, you still see Mistweaver, you still see Holy Paladin, you still see Resto Druid. So right now, the variety of the specs at the top is way more, is way more open, is way more diverse than Season 2. So at the very least, on this front, it's a very good improvement compared to just a few weeks ago, as we still were in Season 2. Now, there is something we have mentioned when it comes to the composition of Mythic Plus, because this might play a big part in the popularity of many specs. As we mentioned, as we touched on the last time, if you took your meta spec you would like to assemble in your strongest Mythic Plus group, if you pick Vengeance, and then you pick Discipline Priest, and then you pick Outlaw Rogue, and then you pick Havoc Demon Hunter, what you're left with is a group of 4 specs that has no Combat Rest and no Bloodlust. That is the biggest issue right now in forming compositions in Mythic Plus. The fact that you need to find a way to sneak in both of them in your comp. Yes, you can rely on someone having the engineering combat rest bracers, but it's not even close to being as good as having a proper combat rest. So if you try to follow the meta to the letter, it's basically faulty, because you're gonna end up without one of these very powerful tools for Mythic Plus. Which is why, even at the very high level of keys, you see there is quite a difference. You see that Vengeance isn't being taken, so that Prot Paladin with a combat rest can be taken. Or sometimes you're not taking the Prot Paladin, but you are still taking the Resto Druid instead of the Discipline Priest for the combat rest. And then you have the third option. What if you still want to run with Vengeance and you still want to run with Discipline? Well, now you need something like a Balanced Druid as a DPS, so you do have access to your combat rest. This is perhaps one of the features that allows this season, at the very least the beginning, where the answer to this problem hasn't been 100% figured out, why we get to see more options, more choices across groups. Trying to solve the issue of, okay, who is bringing all of the buffs we need? Who do we need to mix and match in our group to find the combat rest, to find the bloodlust, so that we can run with the popular comps? That is what has been going down right now in terms of the assembling of the compositions in Mythic Plus, and what perhaps you might have noticed yourself as you try to enter a group and you find that you don't have bloodlust or you don't have a combat rest for your key in Mythic Plus, which is ultimately a good thing. A good thing to give players more option to mix and match different specs and different classes depending on what you need, rather than having the same five specs as a mandatory pick for Mythic Plus, like we had in Season 2 up until a few weeks ago, basically. Now, talking about the performance itself of Mythic Plus specs, it's worth mentioning that the balance tuning that went live at the start of this reset is, of course, not just going to touch the raid results, but will impact the performance of the specs in Mythic Plus as well. In the next few days, we will see the exact value of these changes. In particular, the nerfs to Havoc, the nerfs to Outlaw, the nerfs to Assassination. Those are the ones in Mythic Plus that will have more of an impact, given the power of the specs, together with the nerfs to Beast Mastery Hunter. You know, even by looking at the average DPS results at the end of a key, you can find, for example, the pre-nerf Havoc results being easily 10 to 20, in some cases even 25, or in the more sad cases even 50 or 60% more damage than other specs. So of course we will see just how much the nerf will cut from these results, from Havoc, from BM, from Outlaw, from Assassination, and then even the few ones being buffed, like Devastation, like Unholy Decay, where some of the specs getting more damage at the beginning of this patch, together with the 6% damage buff given to Windwalker Monk as well. Obviously, we are still being very generous to these specs. None of these buffs are enough, even close to enough, to bring in specs like Unholy, or specs like Devastation, or specs like Windwalker to suddenly become one of the top picks in Mythic Plus, but at least it's a start. At least we see an acknowledgement from Blizzard that the specs are not performing nearly as well, or as acceptably average as they are currently. Now, as far as Mythic Plus itself, as far as the dungeons themselves, sad to point out that despite the nerfs we have received at the beginning of last week for Mythic Plus, we are still left with a slight outlier in terms of the difficulty of dungeons. You see, we start from 95% of Black Rook Hold, we go down on a nice and even curve, 94, 89, 87, 83, 79, 73, and then we have a drop. I think that's the correct term for the 47% of Murozond's Rise. That still remains the hardest at this point by a landslide compared to the rest of the dungeons, the hardest dungeon right now in the Mythic Plus pool, even after the nerfs it received. So we will see if Blizzard intends to pile up even more nerfs to Murozond's Rise, even after remaining clearly the more difficult one in terms of dungeon difficulty in this Season 3 pool of dungeons. We can then finish with our typical best and most popular compositions for the week, right as Fortified, Spiteful and Volcanic has ended today or yesterday. We still see the overly popular presence of Vengeance and Havoc. This is not what you want to see ever in a meta. A single class dominating both roles available to them. That's not very good. It's even worse when the class in question is Demon Hunter, honestly. But besides this ugly color being popular, the rest is quite spread and quite even, with a few options here and there, and even as you go deeper and lower down, you do have a decent enough variety of specs, right? What's left now is nerfing Havoc to not be nearly as oppressive. And by the way, this is not nearly enough of a set of nerf to make them any less powerful. And then also nerfing Vengeance, which, by the way, inexplicably was missing from the set of nerfs of this reset. So once that happens, you will have a much more even and nicely set of options for your Mythic Plus composition, which we, to be fair, I've already mentioned being better than before, being better than Season 2 and even better than Season 1 in terms of options available to you when assembling your Mythic Plus group. However, you know, we can still improve, we can still do better, right? We do acknowledge that these two specs right now are overperforming, so we might as well push for some nerfs to these specs to make it even more even and even more balanced in Mythic Plus. That's what we have at the moment in terms of balance state of Mythic Plus. We will have to see a few more days, a few more logs and results to gauge exactly how much the performances of the buffed and nerfed spec is going to be in Mythic Plus, right after the tuning that went live this reset. And besides that, we can still leave on a positive note when talking about Mythic Plus. The positive note of having more than usual, more than average specs available at the higher level in terms of variety, in terms of options for you to choose, in terms of the dungeons not being particularly oppressive or awful as the previous seasons, besides the one outlier we mentioned of Murzon's Rise. So overall, I think the situation is still quite nice when it comes to Mythic Plus right now in this season. I will leave other conclusions related to Mythic Plus to all of you guys down in the comments if you have completely different ideas, perhaps about the difficulty of the dungeons or perhaps about the meta of the specs in Mythic Plus. But besides this, it's now time to leave each other on this Wednesday. We are starting as usual the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can, as usual, still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below. You can also subscribe to the channel itself. You can tune in on my stream whenever I am live in the EU evenings. And besides this, now it's time to say goodbye. Thank you guys for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, it's late, but at least the video didn't get to be that long. I think it's an acceptable length for a Mythic Plus recap.